What is spirituality? Is the topic we'll be discussing. I welcome you all, those here live and those online, hopefully for a meaningful spiritual journey. So this is the word spirituality is a word that is thrown around a lot. People use it all the time. I'm a spiritual person. I'm not a spiritual person. I'm on a spiritual journey. But what does the word mean? And does it even mean the same thing for different people? Everybody may use the word in many different ways. And even when you talk about the different schools of thought, the different spiritual disciplines out there, do they all define spirituality the same way? Very good questions, right? I'll just throw out a few more questions just to thicken the plot. Next question is spirituality have anything to do with things like religion, faith, God, divinity, holiness, sanctity? Or is it completely separate and a different domain altogether? Is there such a thing as secular spirituality? For example, saying someone like soul music, or drinking spirits for that matter, right? Alcohol is called spirits. So when you say the word, it has many different connotations, and we need to define what it is before we really talk about it in any intelligent manner. So you could even argue that maybe it defies description and defies any definition, and it only can be really experienced. But still, as human beings who communicate with each other, we need to have words, and we look for words to speak to each other and try to understand things that we are experiencing in our lives. So I'll try to talk about it now in a very, hopefully in a blunt fashion, as I often try to do. And in a way that, of course, above all, is not just theoretical and abstract, but actually something meaningful and personal to our lives. So, sometimes you can use the word spirit. It's always good to, when you talk about words and etymology and other definitions, is to look at sometimes the contrast. Like, what's the opposite? Oh, I'm glad you're not locked out. Here's a couple, this is a plug for the class, who came, they locked out, so they listened to it in their car, they told me. On what? On Times Square? On the screens in Times Square? Yeah. Oh. Okay. Yeah. So sometimes you want to know what the definition of a word is. So this is a good exercise, actually. It's always good to see what's the opposite of the word. You know, what's the antonym? What's the opposite? So what would be the opposite of spirituality? Interesting question, right? Okay, so some people would say materialism. Materiality. I don't know if there's a word materiality. But like spirit and matter. Something like matter and energy. Which actually is not such a good example, because today we know that matter and energy are reversible. And according to Einstein and modern physics, matter is energy, and energy can be turned into matter. But regardless, let's just use that as an example. So materialism would be defined, it's easier to define materialism than it is spirituality. Materialism is essentially focusing on the material life that we live, usually about our needs and about our wants and our desires, and everything that this material world represents, whether it's from money to power to influence to ego to other whether food, other pleasures, whatever they may be, will go into the world called materialism. In its extreme, it's called hedonism. So that indeed is the opposite of spirituality. So spirituality, one would argue then, is the opposite. If materialism is about self, then spirituality would be going outside of yourself. So if materialism is about taking, spirituality would be about giving. Now many people would agree with this definition. I don't know if everybody would, but many would. But the fact remains that, as I said earlier, you could hypothetically argue that there is also a form of spirituality that is also subject to the vices and the flaws of the human condition. For example, can someone be spiritually arrogant? Can someone be spiritually angry? So then it gets more complicated, because you do see there people who are spiritually arrogant. They feel they're more spiritual than others. They feel they're superior to others. So there are a lot of questions, and clearly, as you probe and you start digging deeper, it makes it very clear that this word spirit is not such a simple matter. So where do we begin? Obviously, coming from the background that I have, which is I come from the world of Judaism, and the world of, including mystical Judaism, mysticism, the esoteric teachings. So what I'm sharing is based on the sources that I grew up with and I study. However, having dabbled, and more than maybe just dabbled, but also been exposed somewhat to other schools of thought, I think some of the ideas I'm going to share are not exclusively Jewish, but they're really more universal. And that's the language I will try to speak in, because generally that's the language I always prefer, because it's I believe the only language that really doesn't divide us, and the language that connects us, is when we find common denominators between all types of people. To me, the deepest truths are the ones that all people from all walks of life can relate to. Doesn't mean we have to agree about them all, but if it's a language that's prohibitive, that only the club, your country club, understands, you tell me by definition what that means. By definition means it's a way of reinforcing a certain herd mentality or a certain conformity. Any ideas that cannot be communicated, a truth that you hold very dear to you, and cannot be communicated to anyone except someone that looks like you, or grew up where you grew up, one has to wonder whether that truth will hold up under challenge. And how do we even know if it's true, if it's just a few people, even if it's a few thousand people, or a few that just agree without any type of, the word I want to use is objective, free inquiry. I say this as an aside, even though it's not such an aside, because it's very relevant. Language here is critical, because I'll talk for a moment about religion itself, including Jewish religion. Children growing up in a home, so the language they will pick up will be the language that their parents speak. And when I say language, I don't just mean the words and the actual language, whether it's English, Yiddish, Hebrew, whatever it may be, or French, or English. I also mean the words. The words, you'll find children repeat the words they hear. Like when a parent is disgusted with something, says a certain word, a child very often will mimic that word. And then the second thing they'll mimic is the words they pick up in school, and by the community and the environment that which they are accustomed to. Now, nothing's wrong with that. However, that can lead to a lot of problems, because if indeed that community and that environment is not such a healthy one, then children will pick up language that reflects not necessarily healthy attitudes. And then when an open-minded person grows into an adult, starts wondering, why do we use this word when we see a certain type of person, which can seem very racist, actually. Even though, frankly, the community may not even mean it racist, it just became a word that you use. We all use words. But some words can be very offensive to other people, whereas to us it may not be offensive. So challenging your own language is a very healthy exercise in open-mindedness. When I say open-mindedness, I don't mean just open-mindedness, I mean also in being a healthy and honest person. Because if I care about you and you care about me, and I use a word that offends you, and I don't even mean it, I'd like you to tell me that this word is an offensive word. And I would maybe challenge you and say, why is it offensive? What bothers you about this word? And we could argue it out, but at least there's a conversation, instead of us being completely like ships in the night where you're blind to another person's perspective on a certain word or idea. And this is vital, especially in our day and age, where there's so much spiritual and religious confusion. We always use my favorite story, Rabbi Jacobson, story about God himself. So he told the self-proclaimed atheist, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. So what do you mean by the word God? And in our case, what do we mean by the word spirituality? So I have always worked very hard, I can't say perfectly, but I try my best, of not letting ever get trapped in words that I grew up with, or language that I'm accustomed to. As a writer, as a speaker, as a teacher, I'm always looking for the words, the right words, and I'll always look for new words because I want to make sure that I'm not using a word that is comfortable for me and expresses what I feel, but maybe no one else can relate to it. And frankly, I think this also makes for better communication. We're speaking to each other, and you don't get what I'm saying, and I don't get what you're saying. Maybe we both have to use new words that create a point of reference. In the language of Torah, it's called a mashal. We use a mashal. A mashal means an analogy, a metaphor. King Solomon, what was he so known for his great wisdom that he was able to give 3,000 metaphors, examples. And not just 3,000 creative examples, but 3,000 levels of examples to bring it to any type of person. When you have an example, then you say, oh, that's what you mean. I got it. Without an example, even at basic communication level, you can't teach children abstract ideas. You need to give them examples from things in their lives they can relate to. And same with adults. You say ideas, it may be a brilliant idea, and you may be very clear about it. But as long as you're stuck to your words, maybe no one else except you will understand what you're talking about. And frankly, I would even argue that if you can explain it to someone with a different language, it means you might probably understand it better. Not probably, but definitely. Because those who understand words, ideas well, can express them in so many different ways, essentially using the language of Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, especially Hasidic thought, putting on the garments of levushim, different garments of being malbish, in clothing an idea in the right garments, in different examples, using different idioms and different contexts, which really helps, of course, the ability to communicate. Just to give I have a flashback when I was in high school. So we had a teacher, an English teacher. In high school, I'm not going to get into all the trouble we caused. I'll talk for a moment, one of the productive moments there weren't that many, but there were some, school. So there was this English teacher who was actually very good, but we used to make him nuts. I regret it till this day, but what can you do? But I remember he asked us all to describe a scene, two scenes. He says, describe two scenes and describe the best way you can. Choose any two scenes, anything touching, moving, awesome, natural scenes, whatever you like. And I remember this vividly, just like today, that I learned something that till this day I still appreciate. Maybe I should contact him and tell him that. He must be an older man today. I don't know where he is to find him. I think I do know where he is, actually. He's not in prison. Some teachers do end up there, or deserve to end up there. So he says, I remember I chose two scenes. One was a sunset, and one was a beach, water washing up on the beach. These were two, I guess, sentiments I wanted to describe. And I remember I described the sun sinking in the sky, trying to describe what does a sunset look like, and what does it evoke, what feeling it evokes. And it's not try it out. It's not, we all know what it is because you've seen a sunset. But let's say you wanted to put it on paper. You want to evoke the feeling of a sunset, whatever that feeling, romantic feeling, a warm feeling, a beautiful feeling, a divine feeling, whatever it may be. And I remember I wrote a plain sentence. We were in 10th grade, 10th grade, and I wrote a plain sentence. And then the second one, I wrote the same thing with the water rushing up on the beach, and bubbly water, and then it gets absorbed by the sand. And he said to me, I remember he called me Simon. To call me Simon. Simon, you can be a great writer. These were his words. He was very proper. He dressed proper. He was a very, one of these real literature professors. He said, Simon, you can be a great writer, but you must learn the secret of the adjective. Those were his words, the adjective. I knew what an adjective was, but I never really, no one taught me how to use it. So he said, adjective is the key to expressing to another person your feelings. So like you said, the sun sets in the sky. No, tell us what color is the sun? The yellow sun, the red sun. And is it a yellow sizzling sun? These are all adjectives. Adjectives describe a noun. So a sun is nice, but when you say yellow sun, or you say red yellow sun, or a different, or a large sun, it changes the whole sentence. And then tell us what kind of sky was it? Is it a blue sky? Is it a gray sky? Is it a twilight sky? He says, use those words, add twilight, add the color, add the shape, add the feeling. That's the sentiment. A noun, everyone knows what a sun is, but the sun has many different modes. And the same thing I remember by the beach, he said to me, he said, the bubbling what? Water? No, the bubbling froth. Frothy water. So then you start thinking of water as like, has this type of foam, or foamy water. And the dry sand, and absorbed by the hungry sands. I mean, that was the word I think I came up with, whatever. Anyway, I remember it was such a very clear lesson. And as I said, I don't know how much more I learned that year, but that definitely I learned. And today, it comes naturally to me, but I remember whenever I talk to someone about communication, I say, so how do you communicate a sentiment? They'll say, okay, I love you. Okay, many people love, but love means very different things from different people. My grandmother used to say, I love you whenever I was a troublemaker. That was the way Jewish grandmothers say. I love you with all my heart. Like, you're making so much trouble. That's how they express themselves. So love doesn't always mean you're in a good mood. It just means that you're so exasperated that the only thing you want to use is, that's a healthy way of saying it. Most people say a different word. So when you challenge yourself, and you're not going to just take for granted that everyone's going to understand what you mean, which is a little form of arrogance in a way, you force yourself to speak a different language, and you end up really appreciating yourself, and as well as communicating to others, a deeper meaning behind whatever it is you want to get across. And it's something that everybody can be taught. You just need a little patience and a little thoughtfulness and care. If you don't care, obviously you'll just bark orders. You'll just say whatever you want to say. Now the truth is, this idea is not, I'm not coming up with anything original here. The Rabbi Tam was a grandchild of the Rashi, a great middle-aged sage. He wrote the classic words from the heart enter the heart. And words that come out of the mouth or come from your brain enter one ear and go out the other. And I shared a line I like a lot, which is, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So how do they know what you care? How could they know? They look at your face? Okay, body language can sometimes convey empathy, but it's not just body language, it's words, certain words you use. You see if someone cares, you see they take the time, they'll go the extra mile to add the right words to explain something. They'll even ask you, did you understand what I said? Things like that. Not in a condescending or patronizing way. So even though this is not the topic at hand, but it actually is, because as you'll see, when you get to words like spirituality or God or religion or faith, everything I just said is compounded. To describe a sunset, how controversial could that be already? Okay, you may describe it better. A good writer would describe it really well. An average writer would describe it up. But when it comes to controversial topics that people argue about, and not only argue about, kill others in the name of religion and faith and so on, and especially emotional words that evoke passion. Like spirituality is a strong word. Spirituality is not a neutral word. It's not necessarily as nuclear as religion, as we'll still talk about, but it's still not it's an easy word. It's not like a parav word, as they say. How do you say parav in English? I don't know. Neutral. There's fleshik, milchik, and parav. Fleshik is like right wing, milchik is left wing, and parav is in the middle. Would that be a way to describe it? Right, left, and center? Maybe. Then they could argue who's right and who's left. You could say, well, maybe you're left and I'm right. Okay, fine. That all depends on perspective. So, since we're talking about spirituality, I thought it's critical to give this introduction to what words mean. So what I'm going to say now is I'm going to try to, as I said, universalize it as much as I can. But obviously it does come, as I gave my disclaimer at the beginning, from background and the teachings I've learned. And speaking in English actually forces me to take the stuff, that material that I've learned was in Hebrew or Yiddish, but mostly Hebrew. And when you read, for example, mystical Hebrew texts like Zohar, or the word writing, or the Kisvei Arizal, teachings of the Holy Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, they're very cryptic. There you have no choice but to explain it because it's cryptic. It's like someone trying to read hieroglyphics, or to read chemical formulas when you don't know what chemistry, or try to read musical notes and you don't know what musical notes are. That's what they are. So you have to translate, and especially the English language. happens to be very helpful because it forces you to bring it to a completely different paradigm. You suddenly have to take an idea that maybe two spiritual people speaking to each other and they know the original Hebrew, they understand what they mean, but no one else does. So having to bring it into other language, like as I said, I did in Toward a Meaningful Life, other books that I've written, or the classes I give, these classes, is really actually very exciting because it forces you to really get to the real heart of it, like I said before with the adjectives. Not just describing words, you're describing feelings. So that's the big challenge, and this is also the big litmus test. And you could use this as well in your own communications. Does it resonate with another person when you share something? So if I were to describe spirituality this class now, and it doesn't resonate with any of you or anyone online, I would have failed, in my opinion. Because I may have described something that meant something to me, but nothing to you. So resonance is really the sign and the test, the litmus test. That's the real Evan HaBoichen, the real way to measure whether you are actually touching the heart of the issue. And that's why I mentioned the adjectives before. Because everybody understands when you say a sizzling hot sun. It's a lot different when you just say sun. Or the blue dark, the blue-black dark skies of dusk. Everybody relates to that because you right away, you envision, when did I see that? And you're evoking a feeling when you say that. Whereas if you just said sky, you're just leaving it to other people's imagination. My sky and your sky, my sky may be a nice blue sky middle of the day, and what I really want to convey is a sunset at evening. It's a very different type of sky. So the same thing here is with spirituality and this topic. So here's how I will define it, and I will, as I said, I'm going to try to not use any particular dictionary, just really use words that I think resonate. So let's begin with ourselves. There's an expression in the book of Job, Eve, where he says, "Mipsari erze leka," "For my flesh I behold God." And it's a tremendous sentence if you think about it. And it's used as a fundamental principle by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Hasidic thought, founder of Chabad Hasidus, the author of the Tanya, Shulchan Aruch. He uses this as a very fundamental principle that everything in this world, in this material world, was created in the image of something greater. We could say in the Friday night prayer, Kegavna. Everything lamata, everything below, is a reflection of above. And this is used many different ways. We say the human being is created in the divine image. And therefore, to really appreciate divine and deeper, I'll include the word spiritual ideas, I'll soon translate it more, it's always good to begin with our own flesh. Because you know yourself. If you can identify something within your own system, you say, look, let's be honest, most of the technology is basically mimicking and takeoff of nature that we see. Human beings studied the human eye, and they replicated it with a camera. A camera essentially is a replication of the eye. Human beings studied birds, and with that they invented and engineered a plane, which was studying nature and studying things help us reflect on them, and they give us a image of another experience. So if you look at ourselves, what's the closest thing? If someone said, what does spiritual mean to you? What is spirit? What's your spirit about? Which you could say synonymous or not synonymous with the word soul. I find that many people who are more skeptical, like spirituality, they have no problem with soul. That one person once told me, soul, you're already getting too close to religion for me, too close for comfort. So I said, okay, so let's stick with spirit. Frankly, for me, there's no real difference. There may be levels of spirituality, like when you say that in Jewish thought, the soul has 5 names. Chamisha Shemus Nikrala. There are 5 names the soul is called. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. Now, in translating them into English, even though there's conventional translations, but they're not that easy to translate. What's Nefesh? So let's say Nefesh is spirit. What's Ruach? Ruach is also spirit. I mean, literally, Nefesh can be a life force. and ruach can be wind or breath. But remember, in the Bible, breath and soul go, neshima and neshama are the same word, neshima and neshama. And then you have neshama, soul, and chaya means life, and yechida means oneness. So I've discussed this in the past, and I don't want to go into these, but my point that I make here is that when you say that we have a spirit within us, so let's use the verse in the Bible. It says God took earth, dust from the ground, he shaped this into like a piece of clay, that's like the shape of a human being. And then, which means he blew into it, he infused into it, he imbued it. A soul of life. So essentially life would be the divine breath. Now, many people in spiritual disciplines absolutely accept that. They have no problem with that at all. They don't necessarily even see it as religious. That's why breathing exercises in many spiritual disciplines are so vital. Because breath is seen as a spiritual force. The Bible uses divine breath. Because at the end of the day, what's the difference between a corpse, a dead body, God forbid, and a live body? What's the difference? You're not going to find any difference in the body itself. The eyes are the same, the ears are the same, the nose. I'm not talking about, God forbid, there's an accident. I'm talking about the body is completely intact. So some people will call it a spirit. This one has spirit, and this one, the spirit has left the body. Some will say the life has left the body. Others will say the electricity has left the body. There you go, a bunch of words. Frankly, they could all be synonymous. It all depends what you're comfortable with. So we could all agree, and I think this does resonate, and I mean, I'm assuming it does because I've tried this out before, that we all have something that we would call a spirit. What that is, we'll soon talk about some more, but that we have something that's more than just your body. So someone say to you, are you anything more than the body I see? I don't think there's a person on earth, even the greatest materialists and the greatest atheists, or the greatest what they call existentialists, are going to say that no, we are only a body and nothing more. They may say that the life force inside the body is just another mechanical element. So the body has the tangible part of the body, but like electricity, it's another part of engineering. They may not attribute it with anything divine or holy or spiritual necessarily. But that there is something that distinguishes between a live body and non-live body is very clear. So spirit in that sense would be a life force. It'd be a form of energy, if you wish, and maybe many more other things. The question is, does it stop there? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, there's a lot of ideas here that we can extrapolate on our own. Everybody can figure out, without much thought, that there's more to me than just my body. You wake up in the morning, yes, your body, you're aware of your body, but are you in a good mood or are you in a bad mood? Are you in a loving place or you're not a loving place? How are you feeling? How's your disposition? Those things are not pure body-like. They are your moods. They are your personality. They are the different dispositions that we have and our different attitudes to things. So there's something clearly at work that's more than just the body. Now, I would say that there's no person on earth as well that does not just satisfy themselves with their body. They do have, let's call it, this energy within them has needs. And we have to either satisfy those needs or we will become anxious or restless. Here you may have a divergence of different people interpreting it, but here's where I will continue and say that just like every one of us has material needs, that's easy to identify. Food, drink, shelter, clothing, protection. Well, you could broaden it a bit more. These are physical needs we all need to be able to exist in this world. We need oxygen to breathe. We also have, and this is where I'm going to use the word spiritual needs that the spirit within this body has needs for. Where would that be expressed? That could be expressed, I'd call it transcendental needs. They're not about the here and now. They're not just satisfied by having a good meal. They could be satisfied through having a good conversation. They can be satisfied through having good friends. They can be satisfied by love and romance, sexuality, and you can go up the list. It can come down to, as Maslow's the pyramid, to things of like meaning in life, purpose in life, spirituality. Maybe I shouldn't use that word because I'm defining that word. Faith, God, religion, obviously family, but that may be included in love. But the point I'm making here, every one of us can identify things that we would call material needs, and others we can call those spiritual needs. So if that's the definition of spirituality, it would be more like transcendent things. Anything that's not materialistic is somewhat in the category of spiritual, which most people do agree with. They disagree with how broad is the spectrum of spirituality. Must it include God, faith, and things like that, which I'm going to be leading to soon, discussing. But everybody can understand that we are more than just the sum of our parts on a bodily level. And for us to be happy, we have to some way nourish and feed the spirit within us. You want to use a different word, use a different word. I'm looking not for the word, but I'm looking for the resonating message that everybody of us can identify with. So next time you go out for entertainment, even things that may not even be so healthy, but they are somewhat trying to get you high, or somewhat trying to relieve your pain, or give you pleasure, those are more than just materialistic things, because it's not just about survival. It's about trying to get to a place beyond just surviving. And humans are in desperate need for that. This is a very non-controversial and very basic translation definition of spirituality. That's why many people have no problem saying, yes, music is spiritual for me. Music does it. Soul music. It touches the soul, it makes me dance. When I hear the rhythm, something in me comes alive and I begin to move. I begin to sing, I begin to feel something. If that's not something spiritual, what is? Many people say that, and it's true. Music today is probably one of the best examples and easy ones to explain. That's why I always believe that through music you can really reach people sometimes much more than through teachings and through dogma, because music people resonate with. Everyone, a nice song touches them. Doesn't matter where it comes from. It has that ability to resonate. And there's no question music goes into the category of spiritual. I mean, I've given long talks on this topic that music is actually transportation of the soul, and it's completely spiritual. It comes from a completely different reality. Because think of life without music, it would be a very pedestrian life. Music is definitely a gift, that almost like a language from another place. Here you and I are having a conversation, but then there's a song, something happens. Something that touches us that just regular words do not. So I don't want to talk about that right now because that's not, if you go online on our site, you'll find plenty of stuff on music. But I'm just using it as an example. So music is a very innocuous, a very non-controversial way of explaining spirituality to people. Now some people will just end with the music, but if you take it all the way, music actually can become a tremendous vehicle for unbelievable growth, which again I'm going to lead to. But again, I'm beginning everything here on the most common, basic level, simply to find the common denominator of what you define spirituality. So music. For others, it could be art, which is just another form. Anything that is more ethereal. So here, introduce a new word, ethereal. Now, some people don't even know what ethereal means. But if you know what ethereal is another very easy way to explain spirituality because it's not threatening. Ethereal simply means it's like ether. It's subtle. Material would be something very tangible, and ethereal would be something more aesthetic. So you could have an object that you can identify with your five senses, but then there's the aesthetics of the object, the ethereal components of it. Often identified with a certain measure of refinement or a certain ambiance. You can go into a beautiful restaurant, everything is great, the food is great, service is great, but the ambiance, someone says, what's ambiance exactly? You can't put your finger on it. It's a mood, it's an environment, it's you're feeling a warm feeling, a warm fuzzy feeling or something like that. Or a bad ambiance for that matter. You go to parties, weddings, as soon as you walk in, you know there's some real bad energy here. Like if the hosts are angry at each other, or the mechatanim don't get along. Even if they don't say anything, you can feel it. Because there's certain things that are not, they're like, Intuitively. We need intuitive tools. If you're more sensitive, you feel it very acutely. There's an expression, I don't even know if it's a real word. My father used to use it a lot. In Yiddish, it makes sense, but I don't think it's a Yiddish word. I don't know if it's a German word. It's called Spitzenfingergefühl. It means like you feel it on the tip of your fingers. You can feel something, you know? It's like I can't put quite my foot, but I sense something. Okay. So these are all, again, examples that everybody of us has, because we have this type of intuition, you sense. So yes, it's the spirit in the room. So you could have everything right, but you could say something in the spirit in this room is missing. Or something in the spirit in the person. The person may be a good person, they may have a lot of qualities, but something in the spirit of the person. What does the spirit mean? So I'm specifically using all these examples because to demonstrate that we are entering a realm and a domain, a realm I should say, that is not so tangible. So you could say maybe spirituality is actually that, the less tangible of life, the intangibles. And the more intangible it is, the less you can really describe it. So it's no problem. I can describe to you this table, but I can describe to you the spirit of the table, or what is the aesthetic quality of the table. That's going to take a lot more effort, because we can relate to tangible things, have descriptions. Like I said before with the sun is setting in the sky. Everyone relates. But if I say the red-yellow sun, red-yellow is not just a color, it's a mood. And right away saying, oh, it's red-yellow, we have a certain feeling. Or the pale moon is very different than just saying the moon. The waning moon, etc., using the examples I gave earlier. So you see that there's a whole language that really enters in the realm that is beyond the nouns and the verbs of our lives, meaning beyond the actions and the experiences, but I shouldn't say experience, the actions and the objects. That's the word I wanted, which is the experience. And the experience is far more difficult to define. So someone comes, let's say, back from one of the 7 great wonders in the world. They were at, the Niagara Falls or some other awesome site. And they try to describe it to you. You never saw it. So who will be a good the good description? So many people can describe technically. They say, wow, those waters were so powerful, etc. But someone that really has the art of communication, it's not just the words. They will convey the feeling. They'll convey the feeling. I remember standing, maybe that's why I did this, maybe that's why I chose that. I remember standing almost all night. I was actually all night by an ocean. I was just hoping to see if the waves ever stop. And I got like this feeling of there's a relentless, that was the word, relentless power of nature. And when you start studying Hasidic thought, you learn about the relentless power of God, the unstoppable. You meet people, unstoppable. The ocean evokes such a feeling. Some people are like, why did the Titanic capture the imagination of so many people? It wasn't just a big ship went down, many ships went down. Because first of all, it was a formidable ship that everyone thought was unsinkable. But the ocean has something that captures our imagination. This ocean, that as great as we are on earth, and with all the great power, you suddenly go into the sea, you're vulnerable. The biggest, you could take the whole New York City, and you put it into a deep ocean or middle of an ocean, and it's all not meaningless. These things evoke certain feelings, whether it's an awesome feeling. I'm not suggesting fear right now, a frightening feeling. I'm just suggesting a feeling. So we're talking about life experiences. So here's the real question. This is how I would pose the first stage of this definition of spirituality. How much of life is passing us by and missing because we are focused on the material, on the nouns without the adjectives, on the objects without their ethereal ambiance? I would say a lot, because we live in a very materialistic world, and we live in a world that is constantly rushing by us, and we don't want to miss anything. We don't even have time. I don't want to use a cliche, but time to smell the roses. What does that mean at the end of the day? Or to see the forest from the trees. It means to pause and not just have this superficial experience, but maybe there's something deeper. You meet somebody. How many layers does that person have? Are you interested in finding out? Are you a curious person, or you have no patience because all you care about, can I make money off this person or I can't? It's about personalities, about relationships, about anything. I remember this class, there It was this couple that would come on an ongoing basis. They were dating and dating and dating, and they never got married. And I would always encourage, I said, listen, you guys seem to be so get along, but they were too busy. He was busy with his business he was building. She was busy with some other things she was doing. And they broke apart. I met them years later, and what do you know? They're married. I was delighted. I said, so what happened? They said, well, my business fell apart. Her innovations or whatever she was up to fell apart as well. So they suddenly had time to talk to each other. So their dating was basically testing all the restaurants in New York to see which is the best restaurant. That's what it came down, the depth of their relationship. But they had much more. They both had more. Who doesn't have more? Anybody that you know that doesn't have more that meets the eye? It's like it's a given. You don't even have to. You don't need a mathematical proof for that. Everybody has more than meets the eye. So where is it? It's lying in your spirit in a place that's less tangible and more ethereal and more ambiance. All the words I used before. So it's right inside. That's why I began. Mipsari, from your flesh, behold, I behold. You behold it from your own self. So do you even know you're a soul? Do you know your spirit? How much do you know about it? Very little, because you need to spend time with it. You don't get to know yourself unless you spend time. And I don't mean get to know yourself as in what your strengths and weaknesses are and how you can manipulate people and where you can maneuver. I'm talking about get to know yourself in a way that humbles you. Get to know the real you, so to speak. Not your business card and not your achievements and not all the conquests. We have many good things. I'm not suggesting that we don't have many accomplishments, but there's a lot more. So essentially the spiritual journey in that sense is really a fascinating journey into your own self and by extension into everyone else around you. Because those that look with those eyes into themselves, that's how they will look at others. If you can't even look at yourself in any more profound way than just the superficial, what do you think you're going to do with others? You're for sure not going to look. Why would you? That classic story where the fifth Chabad, Rebbe Rashab, and his young older brother, Rabbi Zalman Aaron, were playing. As children play. So what they play is they play what they see at home. Their father was a great Rebbe. So one of them was like a Rebbe, one of them was a Chassid. And the Rebbe is sitting at the little boy, the Rebbe Rashab, is sitting at the table, all dressed up like a Rebbe. You're talking about 5-6-year-olds. His brother comes in. A lot of stories about this, but one that I want to focus on is, he says to him, tell me, what is a human being? Or what is a Jew? So he says, a human being is fire. So his brother, Rabbi Zalman Aaron, says, fire. He grabs his hand, the hand of his brother, who's the Rebbe, so to speak, playing Rebbe, and says, if you're fire, how come I don't get burnt? So he answered, because when fire touches fire, it doesn't get burnt. In other words, how we look at each other, if you're a materialistic person, you're going to look at others as materialistic people. But if you see Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, and this leads me to the second stage of spirituality, that spirituality is compared, the soul is compared to a flame. What's a flame? Look at a flame. It's extremely intriguing, a flame. It's not an accident that it's such a central cornerstone in Jewish tradition. Shabbos candles, Yom Tov candles, Hanukkah candles, the menorah in the temple stands out more than other vessels. A flame. Because a flame is the closest approximation to what the soul looks like. The soul of a human being is Ner Hashem, is the flame of God. What is a flame? A flame defies gravity. It transcends. It's the only physical thing that defies gravity. There are gases that defy gravity, but you can't see them unless you put helium in a balloon, for example. A flame defies gravity. And it's always flickering. It's always restless. It's never stationary. There's no such thing as a couch potato flame. There's no such thing as, dead, zombie flame. There's no such thing. A flame is by definition moving all the time. It's mobile. And it illuminates. And it warms. Think about it. These are the components of what really spirit is about. It's alive and always moving. It defies gravity. It's looking not down. It looks to transcend, to reach upward. We look to the sky and we're curious. What goes on? Sumar Menechem. We raise our eyes to heaven. Who created all this? Who put this here? We spend billions, if not trillions of dollars just to find out one thing. To satisfy our what? Our curiosity. Is there life out there? What is going on out there? That's the human being. One of the Rebbe said that a behema, an animal, never saw the heaven. Because it works on all four. And that's what it needs to do, because it's a survivor. It needs to survive. It needs to protect its young. It needs to breed. It needs to hunt. It's to do what it has to do. That's why animals don't look for better habitats. They live in the same habitat. They don't have cell phones. They don't have therapists. And they don't move up the corporate ladder. How do you like that? They have none of these issues. And they have no neurosis, just for the record. Unless human beings cause them to have neurosis. That's possible too. So we look up, and you look up, it's not just a physiological thing, it's a spirit thing. It means there's something in us that we're not satisfied with what's down below. We want to know more. We want to grow. Restless, transcendent, defying gravity. And we constantly look for the fountain of youth. Where can we find that nirvana? And, of course, when you think about it, as I said, and it illuminates and it warms. What more do you need in life? It's essentially the symbol of love. And that's why love and spirituality are also, you'll find, very synonymous in many, many schools of thought. First of all, foremost, Judaism. What is the biggest mitzvah in the Torah? Rabbi Akiva said, the Klal Gadol b'Torah is loving another. In chapter love of Tanya, chapter Lev, in Hebrew Lev is heart. In Hebrew it's made up of the two letters, Lamed Bey is 32. Chapter 32 in Tanya can also be pronounced love. Talks about love. That love, he says, is transcendence. That as long as you make your body primary to your soul, you really can never love another person. Love requires making your soul primary to your body. Your spirituality more important than your physical. Okay. But everything I talked about till now is, I would say, very rudimentary, basic. Here's where it gets really interesting. And that is spirituality an end in itself or not? Like you'll say, okay, fine. Here's materialistic human beings who care only about their own needs and their own survival and their own whatever it is. Okay, someone's more spiritual. They become more refined. They're more giving. They're more selfless. Beautiful. They're more loving. Everything I just described. They're more illuminating. They're more giving. They're more warming. They are not self-contained, which is essentially what the flame is and what love is and all the other descriptions I gave earlier. So it would seem that's it. Great. The goal is to turn from material human beings, turn them into spiritual human beings. Meaning people focusing not just on me and the here and now, and me, but also on some type of refinement, of refining yourself and the world around you. That would make sense, right? However, and this is where I'm not going to say exclusively, but Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality is definitely unique in this matter. That when you go to some of the, for example, Far Eastern disciplines, namely Buddhism and many of its variations, you'll find exactly that. You have the choice to be a material human being or to be a spiritual human being. And I'm not dismissing that the spirituals are very complicated and very multidimensional, and it's not just moving away from the material. It's a profound discipline. But in Jewish thought, there's something interesting. It says that spirituality is a stepping stone, an interface between matter, materialism, and the divine. Very different. In other words, it's not the end of this journey. It's a step toward step 3. So matter would be step 1, material world. Spirituality would be step 2, but step 3 is the divine, is God, is what we call holiness. She said, one second, what's the difference between being spiritual and being godly? The difference between spiritual and being sacred. Isn't it the same thing? It's not the same thing. Because as I mentioned before, you could be spiritual and you can be arrogant. You can be spiritual and you can be arrogant. Doesn't mean that you're not more refined. It means you see yourself as superior to others. The key difference is the following. 2 things. Spirituality is still about you. But however, you're no longer a material being, now you become a spiritual being. So now you've reached a higher level of completion. And holiness is not about you. It's with the introduction of another word called bittul. It's about something greater than you. So can spirituality help lead us to that place? Absolutely. Because a raw material person, a raw naked materialism is all about me, 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 me. That's it. Spirituality at least takes you out of your own physical parameters and opens you up that there's things that are ethereal, there's, like I said, an aesthetic, there's an ambiance, there's other descriptions I gave before, whether it's love, soulfulness. So absolutely takes you out of your own trap. But there's one final step, and that is reaching a place that it's not about you at all, where you become an agent of a higher force. And that's what's called in Hebrew Kedusha. So you could have Gashmias in Hebrew, Ruchnias, and Kedusha. It's not the same thing. It's true that anything holy is going to be spiritual, but not everything is spiritual is holy. That's why you could have spiritual behavior that is very, very actually quite hedonistic. And I'll give you a few examples. You'll find a lot of the spiritual disciplines, especially in the Far East, sexuality has no rules there. As a matter of fact, sexuality is without boundaries, is all part of the spiritual experience. And you can have situations where gurus or so-called spiritual leaders actually taking advantage of their followers. Now, they may not say it's called taking advantage. They'll say it's enlightenment. But how do you know? Maybe it's your own, just your hedonistic pleasures dressed up in language of spirit. And I've met people like this. In Judaism, you'll find the exact opposite. The deeper you go, the laws around sexuality are very, very clear. And there's no compromising, because it's understood that there's a very thin line between sexuality, sensuality, and spirituality. And you must have very clear understanding that even though we may be spiritual beings, but we still have bodies, and we still have pleasures, and we still have egos. What do you do with that? What does the spiritual person do with that? So there are spiritual people, what they do with that is, they try to fight it, they try to annihilate the ego and the self. There is that. Others try to say, you know what, maybe all these rules don't make a difference when you're in the spiritual world. But then how do you deal with things like jealousies and dealing with the human vices? Are we suddenly freed from our vices just because we're spiritual beings? That's why in Judaism they teach a third dimension. That's called becoming Kedoshim Tiyu, becoming a sacred, becoming holy. Holiness means you are becoming something that is not about you at all. And that's what protects us and protects the spiritual person. Because most spiritual people, frankly, boundaries and taboos and the rules are not that important. You know, they're important to keep order in the established order of an organized establishment. But once you reach a spiritual place, spirituality is beyond rules. You ask people, for example, who experimented in the 60s when the psychedelic movement began to take hold. So what was it? It was called sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That wasn't just a line. It was actually seen that way. If you read Timothy Leary and some of the other wizards, or what shall we call them, the spiritual gurus, they basically said when you enter the world of LSD, you free your mind and you free yourself of the man-made boundaries and parameters. And that's part of the spiritual experience. And then things got out of hand. I don't know if you know this, but there was a big debate between Aldous Huxley, who was a very enlightened spirit, and Timothy Leary about the use of LSD, which was the drug of choice. Huxley was an elitist. He said it's only for the people who are already enlightened, so that will help them grow. But you can't give it to the masses because they will abuse it, they won't know how to use it, and it'll end up becoming destructive. And Leary said, no, you got to pump it into the water mains of Washington and Moscow and everywhere in the world, and the whole world will get enlightened. What happened was LSD was became prohibited in illegal in 1966. It's pretty late in the game, as you can imagine. But because it started happening was, I mean, if you remember the Manson murders that were a little after that, I think, around then. When was that? 68? I'm not sure. But bottom line, what was happening in the scenes, these big drugs, psychedelic scenes, was that, yes, it was opening up minds, but there were completely no rules, and it was destroying people. Besides overdosing, people started doing things that they would never do on their own, because once there are no taboos. In Jewish law, it's interesting. On holidays, when people say l'chaim, the Bezdin is supposed to send, the court is supposed to send out messengers to make sure that there isn't inappropriate behavior, because when people start drinking, they get loose. Now, loose is not necessarily a bad thing, when it's checked. So the spiritual person may argue, you know what, no more rules. And the holy person would say, 1 second. You need to have the humility to realize that spirituality is not the end of the story. And that's why you find in Jewish history narratives that talk about this directly. First, let's take the first of them all. Noah. Noah, after the flood, what did he do? He became intoxicated. And to the extent that he was completely nude and ended up being abused as a result. But he didn't get intoxicated because he was a drunk. He didn't get intoxicated because he was looking for a high. He came into a new world and he wanted to do a correction. He saw a world was destroyed by people's self-consciousness. Because the eating of the tree of knowledge was a form of eating from self-consciousness. What's the best way to eliminate self-consciousness is going into oblivion. There are many people who drink, not because they like to drink, it's because they want to numb themselves from existential pain. That's what Noah did. And it was wrong. Then you have the bigger story even. Nadav and Avihu, the two children of Aaron, who Moses later said, I thought that they would be that when God says, B'krevi HaKadosh, the closest people to me will sanctify my name, it ended up being the two children of Aaron. What happened? In their passion and their spiritual fervor, they ran into the temple that was just structured, that was just established, and they ate zara, an alien fire consumed them. And then you have the story, famous story of the 4 people who went into the paradise, the orchard. Ben Azai, Ben Sheshes, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai ben Zema, or Ben Sheshes, I think. And what happened? 3 of the 4 were irreversibly hurt. 1 died. 1 went mad. 1 became an apostate. And only Rabbi Akiva, it says, Nichnas b'shalom v'yatzu b'shalom. He entered in peace and came out in peace. And what is this orchard? The orchard is always a metaphor for a spiritual experience. So Judaism and mystical teachings at length discuss the concerns and the fears of having what's called in Hasidic language a rotzei, a spiritual high without a shuv and a grounding, an inspiration without knowing what to do with it. I was always fascinated, and I did a lot of reading on these genius musicians, like Jim Morrison from The Doors, or Janis Joplin, or Jimi Hendrix, and even people like Miles Davis, who didn't end up killing himself, but all blew their minds out. And an artist, Mark Rothko, and you look at consistently, and you study why all in their early 20s, mid-20s, at the height of their careers. They were very spiritual people, but they had no guidelines. They had no parameters. And at some point you get so high you don't know how to come back down, and then you literally blow your mind out, either physically or overdosing and so on. It wasn't only due to pain. It was due to deep spirituality. So suddenly you see spirituality, even though it seems to be an antidote to materialism, and it definitely is superior to it, has its own risks. Because we are human beings. We still structured human beings. It would be very nice to be able to say, you know what, I'm a material human being. Here, I'll take a pill or 2, or I'll do this act or that act, and now I will lose my parameters. I am now a spirit, a free spirit. But that's not the way it works, because even spirituality is part of the human experience, and we do live in this world, and we do need to eat and drink. And just because transcendence is more important than survival, it doesn't mean we shouldn't survive. So Judaism has to deal with a very complex dilemma here. The paradox of combining a spiritual transcendent experience with a grounded one. And that's why you have the interesting and fascinating insight that in Jewish thought, spirituality, you can reach higher levels of spirituality through an action than through a meditation. Because there's the action that grounds, the mitzvah. I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to. I remember the early years of this class. The arguments. I remember a few people who went to yeshiva actually, and they ran for their lives. They said, you don't understand, we discovered God and spirituality in LSD. We discovered in sexuality. We discovered in all kinds of psychedelic experiences. All the rules were gone. When I went to yeshiva, I remember one guy said to me, it was only about rules. It was the most freeing thing. I discovered a world without rules. And I used to argue with them, and I say, yeah, but so what happened? What kind of life do you have? Are you married with children? Do you have a grounded family life? Are you going to bring healthy children to this world? Or you become a spiritual, selfish guy or woman searching for heaven and beyond. And it was most interesting because what came down to this, that the mitzvah, which is exactly what it is, rules, real rules. You eat a matzah on Pesach and not something else. And that's how you're supposed to eat it, not that. Is antithetical, if you think about it, to free spirituality. Because spirituality is really not about rules. But that's where Judaism is so fascinating, that it says if you want to reach a real deep transcendence, you have to be able to transcend even your transcendence. Even the soul has to be transcendent. And Nadav and Avihu and the others that I said before all made that mistake. Rabbi Akiva entered with humility. So it's not about compromising our spiritual growth and our free spirits. It's knowing and understanding that you need humility to balance it all out. Just to give a small example, two examples. The one I often use is with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He was a great mystic, maybe the greatest, the author of the Zohar. And he had to escape from the Romans, and that's what he did, because they decreed anyone studying Torah would be killed. For 12 years he hid in a cave with his son. After 12 years, finally the decree had ended and he was ready to come back to civilization. So the Talmud says this, whatever he looked at began to burn. Because he became so spiritual and so refined and so ethereal when he saw the pettiness and the nonsense and the superficiality of life that people were living, it began to burn, whether physically or metaphorically. Basically, his intense spiritual fire was burning everything up that was not on that standard or level. And you think, wow, that's amazing, right? Yeah, but which means the verse says, the world was not created, God says, to turn it into a wilderness, into chaos. I want you to create a civilized world infused with spirituality. So Hashem, God says to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, go back a 13th year, Bar Mitzvah year. We need you to be more mature. And the 13th year he comes back and says whatever he saw, he repaired. He saw basically there was a cemetery. The Kohanim, the priests, because they didn't know exactly where the boundaries were, so they had to walk around and around. It was a real nuisance for them, a lot of waste of time. So he helped find a path that was not affected by the cemetery. That whatever he looked at, he began to repair. So which is the more spiritual Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the 12-year one or the 13-year one? I mean, after 12 years or after 13? So initially you think, 1 second, the fire burning fire is very powerful, but fire has to be harnessed and contained, or else it destroys. So the spiritual fire I talked before about the soul, yes, it's a flame, and it's supposed to be restless and not mobile and illuminates and warms, and it's everything I mentioned and defies gravity. But without a wick, what will happen to it? It'll expire. It's called Klois HaNefesh. The nefesh will simply expire. You have stories there was sometimes the mystics would study together, and when one sensed that the other one was about to expire, but due to the great pleasure, he'd give him a bagel with butter to ground him. Today, I think you probably need a little more than that. But the idea is to ground that person. And the second story I want to tell was, again, with the Baal Tanya, Reb Shneur Zalman and his son, the Mittler Rebbe, Reb Dov Ber. So it was once they lived in the same building, the same home, and they were both studying. The Alter Rebbe suddenly hears a baby crying, because a baby fell out of the crib. And he goes downstairs and sees it's the son of the Mittler Rebbe, or a child of his, or grandchild. But the Mittler Rebbe was so oblivious because he was so immersed in his study, he didn't even hear the child. So his grandfather rebuked him and said, someone's studying and not hearing the child cry of a child. In other words, yes, the studying, you could think, well, that's beautiful. He's so immersed in his studies. But that's meaning transcending your own transcendence. It's not about you. Yes, many people have material pleasures. You have spiritual pleasure. You like studying. But then there's a child crying. You don't hear, if you're not sensitive to the cry of a child, then maybe your spirituality has become too much about you. So if you think of it that way, then spirituality takes on a whole different meaning. It's an interface. It's a way. So if someone says, I'm a musical person, I've found my soul, I found my solution. No, music is a tool. It's an instrument to teach you about realities that are deeper than the material here and now. It teaches you about the suprasensory as opposed to the sensory. So here we have eyes, ears, taste, touch, and smell. We have vision, sound, taste, touch, and smell. Okay, that's the materialistic, tangible world. Then you have the heart and the mind, and including the music that touches a place that's beyond the sensory. But that's a journey. Where is it leading to? It's leading to a place. Why are you here on earth? Not just to have spiritual experiences. Not just to even be a spiritual creature having physical experiences, but to be a divine agent, an ambassador, to refine and transform this material world and turn that into a spiritual environment. And for that, you need to have a third step. Spirituality and materialism contradict each other. The third step is the way the Kabbalists put it, that God is not closer to the soul than he is to the body. But you say, one second, the soul seems to be so much more godly. It's more ethereal, it's more transcendent, and the body seems to be the selfish one. Yeah, but the divine is neither of the two. Or to paraphrase another expression of Ibn Gabbai when he says, just like God has the power to create the infinite, he has the power to create the finite. So which is closer to the God, the infinite or the finite? So clearly the infinite will lead you to places the finite cannot lead you. But don't think that's the end of the journey too. The end of the journey is where the infinite and finite meet, where body and soul are fused, where matter and spirit become one. And that is the ultimate objective. Now, will you find definitions like that of spirituality in places? I haven't seen it too much. I have not seen it in most schools of thought. I can't say it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it. I stand corrected if somebody can point it out to me. But my point is not to pull rank. My point is just to make the point that there is spirituality as a means to a higher end. So when it comes to us, yes, we have three dimensions of our life experiences. There's the you as you know it in the most basic level, my body, its needs, the thing you spend most time with during the day. Then there's the spiritual side of our lives, which is like the transcendent, the love, everything I described, the music, the artistic, everything that's not sensory, the more sensual. But then there's a third level, and that is the divine in you, the divine purpose for which you were created, and it's not just about spiritual indulgence. As a matter of fact, at times you have to actually return. When Noach went into the ark, God had to tell him to go into the ark. Lech, he says, Knei Salateva, enter the ark. Boyalateva, sorry. Boyalateva, come to the ark. Okay, fine, now he's in the ark. Then what happens after the flood is over? He's not ready to leave. God has to command, Seimenateva, leave the ark. Why? Because he saw a world that was destroyed. He didn't want to go back. The Baal Shem Tov's words are that the Teva means words, Teva means letter. That he was surrounded by the words of and letters of holy words of Torah and prayer. He wasn't interested in going back into a mundane world. So God has to say, you're looking at the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, and the ethics of the fathers, al karchacha tachai, al karchacha temes. A soul doesn't want to come down to this world. It gives one look at this world from its vantage point. What do you think? Would you want to come? You're living in a completely spiritual environment. There's no issues with health and income and politics and terrorism and death and illness. Why would you want to come to this world? So God says, Al karchach, I compel you to go. I command you to go. You must go. This is because that's the purpose. Now, once the soul comes down, obviously, because it was commanded, it realizes there's something to be achieved in this world you can never achieve in a spiritual environment. Because the energy that's generated from the resistance of a material world catapults the soul to places that it can never reach on its own. So then when the soul senses the mitzvahs that it can do in this world, the good deeds, as Moses told the angels, when the angels said to God, why are you giving this secret treasure of yours to the lowly, to the inferior humans? Give it to us and we'll sing your praises. So God says to Moses, you answer them. And Moses was trembled and he held on to God's throne and said, as a good advocate, a good lawyer, he looked at the Torah, it says, I am your God that took you out of Egypt. He said to the angels, were you ever in Egypt? Do not steal. Do you have any temptation to steal? Do not murder. Do you have any interest in murder? Honor your parents. Do you even have parents? What was the point? That the Torah was not given for heaven. It was given to transform a hostile world into a tame a hostile world and transform it into a home for God. And that the soul suddenly senses that quality. It doesn't want to leave. So God has to command, and now it's time to go back. Noach didn't want to leave. The Meraglim, the scouts had the same issue. We'll read about it next week's Parsha. They didn't want to leave. They're in the wilderness. They're protected by the clouds of glory. They're getting bread from heaven, miraculous water. They can sit and study and pray and connect to the divine. Why would they want to go into a world, like they said, a land that consumes its inhabitants? Eretz echel sheshva. And it's true. Look at anybody who goes into business. More or less business consumes them. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. They wanted to stay in the relatively spiritual environment they were in. But that's not the purpose. That's a spiritual objective, very nice, very admirable, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is you have to enter into a world that's hostile to the spiritual initially, and you illuminate it, you transform it. So the soul, a wick without a flame is going nowhere, but a flame without a wick is not grounded and is not fulfilling its purpose. So spirituality is a stepping stone, it's an interface, it's a transition, it's a, I'm looking for another word, it's a bridge to a higher reality than your own. But then comes another step where you transcend even your transcendence. I'll conclude with this. There's so much more to say on this topic. Maybe I'll follow up with another class on it, but I want to say this. I pointed this out a number of times, something that, I don't know, struck me a little while ago. Someone asks, who's the greatest philosopher in Western history? Most people will say Aristotle. What about the greatest English writer? Shakespeare. The greatest this, greatest warrior. There are a lot of great people in history. And then you ask this question. Where are Aristotle's children and grandchildren? And what about Shakespeare's? And what about Julius Caesar's? And what about all the others? Whoever the greats. Greatest musician, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, whoever you think. Where are their children and grandchildren? Do we even know if they had children or grandchildren? And then by contrast, look at Abraham, Avram Avinu, the pioneer, Av HaMoin Goyim, the father of all nations, who was pioneered on his own initiative. He found God. And then God found him, but he found God. He went to search. And then he made the biggest commitment of all, not just to be a spiritual person, instead of a materialistic pagan individual in the home and the community he grew up in. That alone would have been a great thing. No, that was not enough. What is the greatest compliment God gives Abraham? It's when God's about to destroy the city of Sodom, the wicked city. And this is the only place, I think, in the Torah that God tells us his thoughts. Maybe not the only place, but very, very blatantly. He was considering not to tell Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom. And then the verse says the following, Vashem Omar. And then God said to himself, Hamachasa anima Avram, am I going to hide and conceal from Avram my plans? A man, Lamana shiyitzava es bonov es beise achrav lasis doka mishpat. A man who committed his life and the life of his family and his children that will follow, in other words, generations to come, to a path of justice and charity, of virtue. Well, I will not reveal my plan to such a man. Quite interesting. You'd think quality, you could say Abraham was a brilliant genius. You could say he was a spiritual giant, he was a pioneer, and all these things. It came down to know that he didn't just achieve spiritual heights. He was ready to forego his own comforts, spiritual comforts, to build a family. You see, the Aristotles of history left great legacies. But who has time? When you're a spiritual person, you're a great thinker, you're a great genius, philosopher. You have time for nagging children and diapering babies? I think it was Rousseau, one of the great enlightenment. He was already considered a refined enlightened guy, as opposed to Voltaire and some of the other guys. Look at these brilliant enlightened ones. Rousseau brought his 7 children to the city square and said, I have busy philosophizing, I don't have time for them. Let this community take care of them. I know to us it sounds like abandonment, but it was considered like a virtue. Man, yeah, of course, he's a genius. He doesn't have time for children. This is the difference between spirituality and holiness. Spiritual people, yeah, they have great spiritual heights, but then a person like an Abraham transcends even his own. He can spend all day and all night studying, praying, meditating, connecting to the highest levels of soul that he was capable of. He was a great philosopher, a great thinker. There's the grounding. You need the wick. You got to bring it back into the finite world, because spirituality is not the end of the story. It's the purpose for which we were put here. It's to take your spirituality and build a home. And I believe this is the main reason why the Jewish people are here today. Because this was the commitment. There was never a commitment just to spiritual heights. It was definitely spirit. The whole Matan Torah, if you read the Sinai experience, the whole thing was mystical. They heard sounds, they heard the sights, and they saw the sounds, and there was fireworks. There was a whole spiritual experience. They saw the Merkava, they saw all kinds of things. But that's not where it ends. As a matter of fact, by the 10 Commandments, it says each commandment, their soul expired. That wasn't good. That's not the way it's supposed to be. You have to come back. So you want to see a great person? Yes, it's great to see a spiritual experience, but it's even greater to see someone come back to tell about it. And not just come back, but to build a life based on it. And that's the ultimate. Maybe it's the ultimate spirituality too. In the language of Kabbalah, it goes like Kalim, there's containers, that's like the parameters. Eiris is the energies, the divine. But then there's the Etzem, there's the core. It's not just energy, it's not just spiritual energy, it's not just it's not just material containers. It's the purpose for it all, which is a divine experience that transcends even spirituality itself. So I see this topic definitely deserves more, but as I just said, I don't want to start expiring with my soul, so I'm trying to be grounded and looking at the clock. And like even by Simchas Torah, when they dance the Hakafis, right? You know, Hakaf is like making circles. In Kabbalistic thought, circle is infinity. Circle has no beginning and no end. So that's why they have to say after every Hakafa, Ad Kan Hakafa Aleph, Ad Kan Hakafa Beis. You need to, because when you reach these high spiritual heights, you can easily just not like lose sight of everything. So at times you just need to know, say a pause. So we'll take a little pause here till the next spiritual infinite experience. I hope I did some justice to this topic, but as you can see, it's a big topic. But most importantly, may you all have a very spiritual week, but even more than a transcendent that transcends the spiritual, brings the spiritual back to this material world. That's the real transformation. And then we reach places that are beyond, even beyond. So here we are. Every Wednesday, we continue this journey. And please stay in touch any way that we can be of help. Meaningful Life Center, here we are. And until next Wednesday, everyone be well. Thank you.